Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and I figured it's 2021, it's time to record a new introduction to JavaScript. Before I had like these two intro to JavaScript in 30-minute videos, and they're still pretty good. I still recommend you watch them. But in this video, what I'm going to do is try to do it in 60 minutes, but also kind of go over like setup and things. So basically, you're someone who wants to learn JavaScript. Okay, and keep in mind, I am an instructor for a major boot camp, which I recommend that if you're looking to make a serious career change into software development, to sign up for a boot camp like the one that I work for. So, anyways, you want to learn JavaScript. So the first step is you need to download Node. So you go to your browser, head over to nodejs.org. And you're going to want to install Node. I generally like to always have the newest version, but you would then have to update it. Long-term support version means, you only have to update it really like once every couple of years, maybe more frequently. Here's where they'll explain you what the long-term support schedule means. But the idea is that they'll keep updating this version for any like security patches, while this one will have like a new version like every month or so. Although updating isn't particularly hard. Okay, so just download the newest one. Okay, I'm running Linux. I'm specifically using a Linux version called Pop! OS. So if you want to have the exact same environment that I do, I am using Pop! OS. But really, any version of Linux can do. Windows, Mac are fine. There's a version of Node for every operating system. But if you are on Windows, you do want to install Git Bash. So just look up Git Bash, so that way you have access to a Bash terminal. Bash or Zush are the default terminals on Linux and Mac, so you don't have to really worry about that. It's kind of there from the get-go. But if you're on Windows, you're going to want this tool here, so that way you can follow along with my terminal commands. You don't want to use PowerShell or CMD. Those have completely different commands. You want to use this. Okay, so that is that. So now with that, once you have those two installed, let's double check that you have all that stuff installed. So what you'd want to do is open up your terminal. So I'm using this terminal software here on Linux, Tilix. But I mean, if you are on Mac, just look up terminal. And if you're on Windows, you would just use the software Git Bash. And that'll take you to a screen like this. May not look exactly like my setup, but it's the same thing. And to know what folder you're in, you just do pwd. That tells you what folder you're in. But that's not what we're here for. So if you're not familiar with all the terminal commands, do watch my video on the Bash terminal, so that way you can learn all those commands. I won't be using too many of them here, but I do want to make sure that we have things installed. So to make sure that you have Node installed, you just do node -- version. And that's going to tell you what version you have. Okay, cool. And as long as you got a recent version, you're in good shape. Okay, now if you want to update your Node, the easiest way to update Node is you want to install this library, npm. So once you have Node installed, you'll have access to npm. And npm is going to allow us to install like extra packages from the Node package manager library. Think of it as like code other people made to do cool things that we can use. Okay, but once you have access to that, once Node is installed, this command gave you some version number. You're going to be able to do this, npm install. That means that you want to install a package. -g means you want to install it globally. Generally, you rarely want to install anything globally. Generally, if you don't know you should install it globally, don't install it globally. That's sort of my policy. npm install -g, and then you want to install this library, literally that's just called n. Okay, I've already installed it. You might, if you're on Linux, you're probably going to have to use the sudo command to install it. Sudo, again, if you're on Mac or Linux, means, well, I always think of it as super user do. So it gives you extra permissions to do extra sensitive activities on your computer. So when you use sudo, it's going to ask you for your password, so that way you can install this globally. So generally, at least in my experience, whenever I do a global install, I have to use sudo, so that way I have enough privileges to do the global install. I've already installed this library, so I'm not going to reinstall it again. So I'll let you do that. Okay, and let's see here. Next thing we want to do is to update it in the future. So once you have that installed, all you have to do is just type in mn latest, and that's just literally going to update your node. So n latest. Okay, but I'm going to leave that alone for now, just so you're aware of how to do that. Now, the thing is, we now need some way to edit code. So the next thing you need to go and install is Visual Studio Code. So go back to your browser. Okay, and let's look up Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code. Okay, there it is. So code.visualstudio.com. Again, install the version for your operating system. This is what's referred to as your editor. You can kind of think of it as your IDE. IDE kind of means a slightly extra set of tools, but essentially you can do all your coding from here. Okay, and it's free, and it's awesome, and it's great. So once you have Visual Studio Code installed, you'll see like a little thing like this in your menu, wherever it is. Just open up Visual Studio Code. Now, my Visual Studio Code may look a little bit different than yours because I have what's called our extensions. They are things to kind of beef up your Visual Studio Code. So, for example, the colors here you see on the side, I got that from like right here, this section right here. That's where you can kind of like install extensions. So a lot of really good ones to install, and I have a whole video on which Visual Studio extensions you should install. So I would kind of point you in that direction, but I'll just kind of quickly flip through them so you can kind of see which ones I have. They won't matter too much for what we need to do in this video. Okay, cool. So now you got your setup installed. Okay, and you have Visual Studio. Now here's the thing. In Visual Studio, you'll have this command bar. Again, if you're on like Mac, it's going to be like over here in this area. But the idea is you have all these options. I like to turn on autosave. That's personal preference. Just keep in mind that like you make a change you don't want to make, or you accidentally delete half a file, it's going to autosave. So, but if you don't autosave, make sure that you save regularly, because a common problem is people think their code's not working. They just didn't save it. And generally, you'll be able to tell if code is not saved. You'll see like a little white dot next to the file name, which means hasn't been saved yet. Okay, so what you want to do is open your VS Code to a folder. So if you're on Linux or Windows, there should be just an open folder command, and you can just open an empty folder somewhere on your computer. If you are on Mac, it's just, I think it's just one open command, but you can just select a folder and open that folder in VS Code. So you see I have a folder called JS60 currently open in my VS Code. Any files, right now there's no files in there. Visual Studio Code will constantly make this little VS Code folder in your wherever you work. Basically, it's saving any settings you have for when you set while working in that folder. So that's all that is. Never really need to touch it. You can go look inside of it if you really want. So see, it's like all your VS Code settings. So for me, see, it's keeping track of all the colors that were changed and stuff. Okay, and just to kind of give you a little bit more tour, here's where you can kind of see the files. This is like search, so you can search through all your files. This has to do with Git. We're not going to talk about Git. This is a running and debugger. I've never really used it. This I don't think comes out of the gate with VS Code. Actually, I'm not sure if that comes out of the gate with VS Code either. Because again, some of the stuff you see here is from different extensions that I have. So yeah, all this is from different extensions. Okay, cool. So what we're going to do is just make our first JavaScript file. So here in VS Code, all you do is you just hit the new file button. And we're going to call this 101.js. Okay, so all JavaScript files end in the extension JS. Okay, and then you're going to be in this file. And in the file, all you want to do is type in console.log. Console is an object that represents the terminal. So if I open up the terminal, see here in VS Code, there's a menu item called terminal. I'm going to create a new terminal. And that automatically is going to open up the terminal to the folder you have opened in VS Code. So you see I opened up the JS60 folder. So that's where the terminal was opened in my VS Code. And I can see that it's specifically a bash terminal. Okay, if you're on Windows, it's probably going to default to CMD or PowerShell. If you're on Mac, it's going to default to Zush. That's fine. Zush is fine. But if you're on Windows, you probably want to go to the select default shell, and that's going to allow you to choose from all the different shells on your computer. Make sure you choose bash or git bash as your default shell, so that way you have commands that'll follow along with what we're doing. Okay, and console.log represents this terminal window. Okay, it's an object, and you'll learn lots about objects throughout JavaScript. And this log is a function of the console. So whenever a object has functions, little things we can use, we access it through dot notation. Okay, so that means we say, hey, of the console object, we want to use the function that it has called log. And what log does is print text here to the screen. So whenever you use a function, you have to pass in parentheses. It basically, think of it as like a little mouth that's casting a spell. So I'm casting the spell called log, and inside the parentheses, I'm saying, hey, like any details that are pertinent to the thing that I'm trying to do. In this case, what text do I want to print on the screen? This is referred to as an argument that I'm passing to this function. So to the log function, I'm saying, hey, print hello world on the screen. So now that I've done that, I can run this file. And again, always keep an eye out right over here. If the file is not saved, you should be seeing a white dot here, which means you should save your file first. If you don't see a white dot there, then you're in good shape. And to run the file, you're going to use node. Node is the command to run a JavaScript file in your terminal. And then you put the name of the file. So 101.js, and see it does what I told it to do, hello world. Okay, and this console log is going to be your best friend, because Node is just going to run the code. It's not going to tell you what happened. So the only way for us to know what happened in our code is to print things every once in a while, to tell the code to say, hey, can you show me what's going on? So we'll do that. So for example, the next thing you always want to know when you learn a programming language is how to store information. And we store information in what's called a variable. Okay, a variable is just something like, generally we'll use like the prefix const. So there's 3 of them. We'll go through all 3. But const declares a variable. So I'm saying, hey, it's a new variable. I'm going to call this variable myvar. You can call it whatever you want. And I'm saying equals. Anything that's after the equal sign will be stored in this variable called myvar. So we'll just say the number 5. So I'm saying store the number 5 in my var. This is what's called assignment. This is the assignment operator. Okay, so I'm not saying is my var the same as 5. I'm saying my var going forward will equal the value of 5. I'm assigning it a value. I'm giving it a value. I'm saying I'm storing this data in this variable. Now, how do I know that it's actually in there? Let's log it. Console.log my var. And then if I hit node101.js, I can see my var did receive the value of 5 because we logged my var, and turns out the value of my var is 5. Okay, so we can create variables to hold data. That you generally want to work with variables. You really want to avoid hard coding numbers. You want to avoid hard coding anything. The goal is to kind of write code that kind of magically works. Now there's other ways to declare a variable. Now here's the thing. When you use the word const, it's constant. So I can't change it. So if I were to go back and try to change my var and change it to 6, that's called a reassignment. I can't do it. It's going to give me an error. Okay? And notice these node errors. So see, like the error goes from here to here. Generally, what you want to look for is this line right here, type error. This is what's referred to as a stack trace. So it gives you sort of like a chain of like what went wrong. This is generally not as useful, at least especially if you're new, to figuring out what's going on. This line above the stack trace from node is generally always going to have the thing that's going to tell you, okay, here's where I need to go look. And then right above it as well, because right above it's going to kind of point you to the line here. So it says, hey, the error occurred in 101.js on line 3. So line 3 is here. Okay, so I know the error happened there, and it's complaining about this specific thing here. Okay, and what is it saying? What's the error? Assignment to a constant variable. Again, you can't reassign constant variables. Although, heads up, 90% of the time you'll find that you don't really reassign variables almost ever. Okay, like you'll see that most of the time you're just creating new variables and variables get tossed. People think, well, I probably should try to make my variables reassignable because, I might need to change them later. You rarely do. And generally, if they do need to be reassigned, they're generally going to be tucked away inside of like an object or an array where you can do so freely. And you will know what that means later on. Okay, other ways, but if I did want to make the variable reassignable, I could use the word let. And now this would work. Okay, and I'll put an extra console log. Okay, so that way we see that my var changed. So we should see 5. So basically we set my var to 5, then we log it to take a look and should give us 5. Then we change my var to 6, and then we log it again to see that it changed to 6. So let's see if that's what we get. And that's what we got, 5, then 6. So far not so bad, right? And the cool thing is you can assign, you don't just have to assign a specific value, you can assign an expression. So I could do my var is 5 plus 5. That's a mathematical expression. So what's going to happen is that before it actually assigns the value, it's going to evaluate the expression. So it's going to say, okay, hey, you gave me 5 plus 5. Let me see what 5 plus 5 is first. So basically what's going to happen is at first it figures out what 5 plus 5 is, which is 10, and then it's going to assign 10 to my var. Okay, so always remember when you're doing like an assignment, it's going to evaluate any expressions after equals before it actually does the storing of the value. Okay, so I'm not storing 5 plus 5, I'm storing the result of 5 plus 5. And then this expression can be as complicated as I want. I could be like 5 plus 5 plus 5 divided by 3, which again, that'd be like 5 plus 5 is 10, 5 plus 5 is, well actually technically the division would do first. So if I really want this to happen first, I'll use parentheses, just order of operations from like grade school. So then I'll use parentheses to say, hey, do this first. 5 plus 5 plus 5, 15. Then take that 15, divide it by 3, which would be 5, and that gets stored in my var. So whatever expression you want, you can do as many as you want. There's a third way to declare a variable called var. It's more of an, back in the day, let and const didn't exist, so people used var. But now that let and const exists, there really isn't ever a good reason to use var. Okay, so don't. Okay, unless you really have to, and there really isn't a reason you have to. There are some differences between the three. I highly recommend watching my video Scoping Masterclass to get a little bit more depth on sort of what's the difference between const, let, and var, and just overall like the topic of scoping, which is really important, meaning like where do my variables exist? Okay, just to kind of give you a quick example of that is if I were to declare this variable here, so let's say I were to create like curly brackets. Okay, now I create var, we say var cheese equals a string. So a string is a value that's words, and it's always in quotation marks. Could be double quotes, could be single quotes, and it could be backticks. Backticks are these weird little single quotes that are above your tab key. Okay, actually the backticks have a little bit extra powers and extra features. I recommend watching my string masterclass to learn more about sort of string manipulation and stuff. Okay, they get to do more cool stuff with strings. Because again, this is an introductory video, so I'm not going to go too far in each thing. Okay, so var cheese equals Gouda, but let's say I wanted the console log cheese here. This will work fine. Okay, because var just really lets you create global variables almost all the time. So the variables that just exist everywhere. That's not necessarily what you want. You generally want to keep your code very controlled. You want to know that variables only exist for a period of time, and if you need them to exist in other places, you'll handle it. You don't want the code to do it for you because it just makes things more unpredictable. And unpredictability means bugs. So in that case, if I use let or const, they are both what's called block scoped. So anytime you declare a variable using let or const within any set of curly brackets, it only exists within those curly brackets. So in this case, if I run this code, I'm going to get an error. Okay, and see, it says cheese. So see, it's saying it ran into this error on line 5, because I can see that line 5 right there. And I can see that the thing that errored was this log of cheese. Now, what kind of error was it? Is that cheese doesn't exist. But it's like, wait a second, I declared cheese right here. So what you're telling me cheese doesn't exist? It does. Oh, it doesn't, because since I declared it using let, the minute this curly bracket closed, cheese evaporated into thin air. Okay, and that's not a bad thing. Again, you don't want your variables existing all the time because they have to be in your computer's memory. So the more variables you have existing all the time, the more you're just kind of using up memory that doesn't necessarily need to be used. Okay, so it's not a bad thing. That's why we prefer let and const. That block scoping, it can be very valuable. Okay, so what we learned so far, we learned we can declare variables, and then again, there's different types of variables. So we've learned that there's numbers. So, okay, we'll call this num, const num equals 1. We've learned that there's variables that are strings. So I'll put a variable named stir that equals hey there. And the variable we haven't talked about yet is called a Boolean. A Boolean can either be true or false. But these are and notice that this is the difference between a Boolean and a string is that a Boolean doesn't take quotation marks. So, and there's only two of them, true and false. That's it. Okay? Generally, Booleans are used for like switches or to make sure like, hey, this thing happens if this is true, this thing happens if it's false. Okay? So true, 1. Okay? And those are your 3 main types of variables in JavaScript. There are a couple different variables that equal nothing. Okay? So, for example, the first thing that equals nothing is called undefined. That's actually a variable. You can just type undefined, and that just means there's no value. You haven't defined it yet. There's also const nothing2 equals null. Okay, and see, that just means nothing. Okay. So these always mean nothing. And again, there's very few what's called reserved words in JavaScript. These are words that you can just use freestanding, and they actually have a value in JavaScript. So these are not strings because they don't have quotation marks. They are different values. This is the value of true. This is the value that there has been no value defined. This is the value that there is nothing. These are both really nothing. Okay? And then again, I can log all these variables. So if I go console.log, and I can console log them in the same log. I can be like num, stir, boo, nothing1, and nothing2. And I will log all of them. So then I run the code, node101.js, and then you can see 1, hey there. So see 1, hey there, true, undefined, null. Nice. Okay, so I can log all those variables. Cool. And but see, they're all on one line. If I wanted them on multiple lines, then I could just log them. I'd have to do separate logs. So console.log, stir, and you can see now they'll be on multiple lines. See 1, hey there. Either way is fine. Another good strategy to use is to label your logs. So what a lot of people will do is they'll do something like this. You know, they'll put first a string, kind of as like a label, and then they'll log their variable. So that way you get something like this. So you see number 1, and that's a little bit more clear as to what you're logging. And that makes life a lot easier, especially when you're debugging lots of code. Having those little labels there just helps makes it clear, like, okay, which log are you looking at? Because it does get pretty overwhelming pretty quick. Okay, so again, I mentioned that there's expressions. So we already saw that there's a math expressions, okay? And let me just console.log num. Okay, so we saw that we can add, and I'll run the code. So we see 1 plus 1 is 2. Okay, we can subtract with a negative sign. So that's going to be 0. We can multiply. 1 times 1 is going to be 1. And then 1 divided by 1 is going to be 1. Okay, so you have different math operators. There's a couple more. There's 1 to the, this is the exponential operator, so it's like 1 to the first power, which should still be 1. Yep. And then there is 1 modulo. Now this one I want to spend some time talking about because this one's actually fairly important. You may not be familiar with what's this operator called modulo. It's the remainder operator. The way you want to think about it is that the first number is how many slices of pizza you have. So let's say I have 6 slices of pizza and I have 2 friends. So if I have 6 slices of pizza and I'm going to distribute that among 2 friends, well, each friend is going to have 3 slices of pizza because I always have to give them the same amount of slices. So how many pieces of pizza am I going to have left over? 0. Now let's say I have 7 slices of pizza and 2 friends. I give 3 to one friend, 3 to the other, but there's still 1 pizza left over, so there's a remainder of 1. Now, how is this useful? Well, the idea is that if the result of a modulo is 0, it means that number is divisible by that number. So in this case, this will result in 1, so 7 is not divisible by 2. While 6 would result in 0. Okay, and again, I'll just log it just so you can see it. So see, it results in 0. 7 results in 1. So 6 is divisible by 2. And where that's particularly useful with 2 is that a number that's divisible by 2 is even. So 6 modulo 2, if anything modulo 2 equals 0, that's going to be an even number. Okay, so that's what modulo does. A couple other good mathematical things they have is they have incremented decrement. So I can do like 5. Well, actually, let me change this to a let so you can kind of see this at work. Let num, and then we'll do, so num starts at 5, and that can do num plus plus, num plus plus, which means I've added 1 to num. So I've added, so it goes from 6, 7. So then when I console log it, it should be 7. And see, there it is. I can also do minus minus, which will decrement it, meaning it'll subtract 1. And there we go, we're down to 3. Cool. Now that's all fun and good. Now another cool thing you can do is you can compound, because like I could do this. I could change num and say num now equals the original value of num plus 1. So I'm saying, hey, num equals 5 plus 1, so this is going to end up being 6. Okay, so let's just test that out and see that's 6. But see, I had to type num twice. So to make life easier, JavaScript has this compound operator plus equals. So that's the same thing as me saying num equals num plus 1. It's just basically going to add 1 to num and make that the new value of num. So in that case, num is 6 again. But so you can do that with minus, you can do that with division, you can do that with multiplication. So these compound operators are pretty nice. So that's kind of like the pieces you have to create mathematical expressions. Okay, there's also this math object that has like little features. So like I can generate a random number using math.random, but the random number is always like between 0 and 1. Oops, I have to use a function. So see, when I logged math.random, see, just did the function because I didn't actually use the function. So I'm just literally logging that there is a function. To use the function, again, I always got to use parentheses. So to get the result I wanted, and there's my random number between 0 and 1. Again, I got a cast spell. Again, think of functions like recipes. Unless you cook the recipe, all you have is a piece of paper with a recipe on it. Okay, cool. Because random is a function of the math object. So far you've seen 2 objects at play. We've seen the console object and the math object. And both of these objects have functions that are built into them. A random, log. And the reason I'm pointing that out is because later on you're going to learn how to create your own objects, how to create your own functions, and you can see that you've already been using these things from the get-go, just using ones that are built into JavaScript. Okay, cool. Now, next let's talk about Boolean expressions. So we'll say const myBool equals, and you can assign what's called a Boolean expression. That's an expression that's always going to resolve to true or false. So we'll console.log myBool. And let's ask ourselves. So first we say, okay, is 5. Now if I want to ask 2 things, whether they're the same, I'm going to use triple equals. You could use double equals, which is called inequality. But there's some quirks with it. Mainly like, here, I'll show you an example. So if I use 2 equal signs and I say, hey, does 5 equal the string of 5? I'm going to get true. So even though this is not really a number, it's going to be like, yeah, I guess they're the same thing. Okay, they're assuming your intention is that you're really comparing sort of the numerical value of the string of 5 had it actually been a number, which sounds convenient, but not a good way to do things. So they later on added strict equality, where now that would be false, because 5 and the string of 5 are not the same thing. But the numbers 5 and 5 are the same thing, so that returns true. So again, this is the expression. I'm saying, is 5 the same thing as 5? Now I can also ask, is 5 greater than 5? And again, the result of this expression gets saved in the variable. So again, the expression always resolves first. So this is the expression. First thing JavaScript's going to do is going to resolve the expression. So it's 5 greater than 5. That's false. So this turns into the value of false, and false gets stored in the variable myBool. Okay. And I can do greater than. So if it's 5 greater than 5, no, it's going to be false. Is 5 less than 5? That's also going to be false. Yeah. There we go. Less than 5. Okay, is 5 less than or equal than 5? Now that's, well, oops. That is true, because even though 5 is not less than 5, it is equal to 5. So you have a lot of different operators. You can also do greater than. So greater than or equal to. Then there's not equal to. So there's not equal, and then there's like strict not equality or strict inequality. So this is like, is 5 not equal to 5? That's going to be false, because they are the same. So you have a lot of different Boolean expressions, and you can actually do multiple Boolean expressions. So I can actually then do, is that true? And is 6 equal to 6? 6 is equal to 6, but so this is true. So again, the way this would read is that this would resolve first. So is 5 not equal to 5? That's false. Is 6 equal to 6? That's true. Then it's going to say, hey, is false and true both true? Nope. This is true, but this is false, and means both have to be true. So then this whole thing just resolves as false. Okay? But if I change this to or, to sticks, to what's called pipes, it'll do this. This is false. This is true. But it's just saying, hey, is this or this true? Well, yeah, this is true, so that's fine. So then this will resolve as true. Okay, so you have a lot of different ways of asking a question. Okay, and that's going to be really important to think about that, because you're going to find yourself often having to ask questions of JavaScript, like, is this thing true or false? And because you can use it in things like if statements. Okay, so if. So here now let's just change this variable to const my num equals 5. So, and then when you see an if statement, it's like here we're starting to get into control flow. The idea that some code may or may not run. So in the parentheses, we have to put a Boolean expression. Okay, I could just literally write the word true, and that's just true. That's easy enough. And we can say console.log. It is true. So I go boop. It is true. And if I write false, because that's the value of false, it won't run the code, so nothing happens because it's false. Or you could do a Boolean expression. You can actually write an expression and it resolves it. So I can say, hey, is my num greater than 3? So 5 is greater than 3. So then that's going to be true, so it'll run the code. Okay, and you can stick just random values in there. For example, if I put the number 3 in there, well, that's not a Boolean. That's not true or false, is it? Well, JavaScript is constantly going to try to coerce values. Okay, JavaScript, unlike a lot of other languages, they don't assume things. So you were to give this in another language, it'd just be like, that's not a Boolean. What are you doing? JavaScript is going to constantly try to figure out, what did you mean? So JavaScript has a lot of these default interpretations built into it. And in this regard, JavaScript is going to coerce the value to true or false. So anything you put in this parentheses in the if is going to be coerced to true or false. And the rule basically is for numbers, the only thing that's treated as false is 0. So 3 is going to be true. So the code will run. If I do, even if I do like, if I did like -1, okay, let's try that out. I still get it is true. The only number that gets treated as false is 0. Okay, so 0 is what's called falsy, meaning it's going to get treated as false, and every other number is truthy, meaning it's treated as truth. Now when it comes to strings, if I put in like a string with a space in it, it's like that's not true or false, that's just a space. Guess what? That's going to be true. If I literally write in the string of false, that is not the value of false, this is still true. Okay, so let me go back here, run that code. That's still true because it's a string. The only string that's ever treated as false is an empty string with no spaces. That will be treated as false. See, doesn't run the code. And when it comes to Booleans, false is false and true is true. And later on, we're going to learn about arrays. An empty array is still true. See, and an empty object is still true. There is no such thing as a falsy object or a falsy array. Okay, these will always be true. Okay, so keep that in mind. It's good to know what's true and what's false. But that's all an if does. An if just says, I'll run the code if it's true, and if not, do something else. Okay, so if I want to do something else, if it's false, I have to use what's called an else statement. So else console.log, it is false. Okay, it is false. Cool. And if I do that, now if I make this 0, that should be false. So I should get it is false. And then if I put in 1, 1 is going to be treated as true. So that should be it is true. So there's going to be a lot of times where you just have code that you want to do this or that, depending. And basically the idea is you're asking your question in here. Here you're putting in the expression. And then here are what happens. Now the next thing we want to talk about is a loop, where you want to repeat code over and over again. So the idea is you want to repeat code over and over again. You're probably going to want a way to keep track of how many times you did it. So you generally want to create a counter. So let's create a variable called counter. We want to use let because we're going to be changing the value of it. So let counter equals 0. And once the counter equals 0, we're going to create what's called a while loop. And basically what it means is while the Boolean expression we put in the parentheses is true. So we'll say while counter is less than 10, do the thing in the curly brackets. Okay. So then in this case, we'll just say we're going to console.log counter. So we get the number that counter is. And then after each count, we'll do counter plus equals 1. We're going to add 1 to counter. You could also just do counter plus plus. That would also work. You could do counter plus or counter equals counter plus 1. Any of those would add 1 to counter. But now let's see what happens. Okay, you see it repeated the code. The first time counter was 0. It logged counter. Then it added 1 to counter. When the curly brackets end, it jumps back up here and checks, is counter still less than 10? Well, counter's 1 now. So, but that's still less than 10, so it runs the loop again. So then it's 2, then it's 3, then it's 4, then it's 5, then it's 6, then it's 7, then it's 8, then it's 9. Okay, so you get the idea. Now this is fine. There's also another type of loop that takes everything we did here, and so like see here, there's like a whole adding 1 at the end of each loop and creating a counter. There's a loop that just kind of builds all that into it. Okay, that's called a for loop. So for loop, instead of having to declare the counter outside, I can just declare the counter inside the parentheses. So let counter equals 0. Then I use a semicolon. Then I put my expression, so long as counter is less than 10. And instead of putting the plus 1 outside, I can just do it here. Counter plus equals 1. And this is the same exact thing. And then I just console.log counter. Okay, so basically initiates the counter. On each loop, it's going to check whether this is true or not. As long as this is true, it'll keep looping. And at the end of each loop, it'll do whatever I put over here. Okay, and I could change that. It doesn't have to be plus 1. It could be plus 2, plus 3, whatever you want to do. Okay. And now, I get the same result. Okay, so these are just two different loops, for loops and while loops. And rest assured, you'll forget things. You're never going to just learn programming and have everything like just quickly at the top tip of your fingernails or your fingertips really quick. You'll find yourself constantly Googling stuff. Okay, and it's not bad. Okay, like if you're trying to remember how do I do an if statement, you just type in like JavaScript if statements in Google. Okay, you want to be specific. You always want to make sure you name the language that you're working with and sort of the thing you're trying to look up. Okay, so that way I can look it up, and oftentimes you'll actually get like a snippet right there. But really the best places to go are going to be like MDN, which is like developer.mozilla.org, and W3 Schools. They're going to have pretty good documentation. They kind of review any of these things. So I can see like here's a syntax for it and kind of go on from there. So don't be afraid to Google, or if you get an error, Google the error. So I would just type in like, for example, if I got that error, like variables undefined, so I say, okay, I'll say like JavaScript, and then if I got the error like variables not defined, I just type in is not defined. So that way it knows kind of like I'm looking for is not defined in relation to JavaScript. Okay, and then it'll give me some more details on the error. So I see here reference error, X is not defined, and then it give me some more details on what this error means, so I can kind of go back and debug it. Okay, and that's generally how you're going to get more comfortable with this stuff. You'll have to Google these things lots and lots of times before some of it really, really sticks. But don't hesitate to do so. And again, make sure you structure those searches in a way that's sort of informative. Okay? And it will help you. And like that's skill in itself. Like once you get better at finding, like asking the right questions of Google, you'll be surprised how oftentimes you'll get through hurdles pretty quickly. Okay, so we now know how to do a for loop. Few more things to discuss. Now let's just talk about how would you save multiple pieces of information. So there's two ways to save many pieces of data in one variable. First one is called an array. So we're going to say const my array, and my array always equals square brackets. So in this case, I'm saying my array equals, and here's the thing, you can use const with my arrays and edit them, because think about it this way. Think of an array as luggage. I can put a lot of clothes in my luggage. Okay, but if I switch out one piece of clothing for my luggage, I haven't replaced the luggage. So technically what the variable holds isn't the individual clothes, but the luggage itself. So only if you were to assign it a new set of curly brackets would you actually trigger an error. So for example, I can do this. I can be like const my array, and arrays have a push function to push and add an item into it. So I'm going to add the number 5. Okay. Oh wait, no const, no need for const. Not declaring a new variable. Okay. So I'm actually editing the array, but it's not going to cause any kind of error, even though I declared it with const. See, and there's my array with the number 5 in it. But if I tried to do this, okay, now it's going to think that I'm trying to create a new array. Like these square brackets only represent like a new luggage, and I'm trying to say the variable equals the new luggage with the contents inside of it, and that's going to cause an error. See, assignment to a constant variable. Okay, so just that's one way to think about it. Cool. And then I can actually put stuff in there from the get-go, and it doesn't have to be the same type of information. So I could put a number, I can then put a string, and I can then put a Boolean, and I can log each of those individual values. So first we'll log the whole array. So you can see like the whole array has all those values inside of it. So you see there's my array. And now what if I want to get to one of those values by itself? You do console.log my array, and then after the name of the array you put square brackets, and then you have to specify which item in the array you're trying to access. The first item is always 0. And then the next item would be 1, then 2, then 3. These are referred to as the indexes of the values. So my array will console log the second index, which is 1, and then console.log my array, which the third index is 2. So I was able to access the whole array by just logging the array variable, but I could access each individual element of the array using its index number. Okay, so that's an array. There's a lot of stuff you can do with arrays. It's actually probably one of the most important things you really want to kind of get a handle on in JavaScript. So do watch my array masterclass video to get the full sort of depth of arrays. So just look up like Alex Merced array masterclass. Okay, now for objects. So objects are another way to store lots of information in one variable. So let's call this my object. And objects use curly brackets. And instead of putting stuff like in a numerical order, you give each variable a name. So you say, literally, we'll say this is my name, Alex Merced. So that's the first property. And then the second property is age. My age is 35. So again, the first one is always called the key. So this is the key. That's the thing that lets me get to the actual value. And the value that's stored in that key is Alex Merced. And again, I can console.log the whole object. So I can just say, hey, console log my object. And if I do that, I'll see that, hey, there's my object. It's a thing with like that describes me. Okay, so that's kind of like console was an object, math was an object. So we saw those, we were able to access its properties using dot notation. Same thing here. So I can access console.log, I can console log my object, and access the name by using dot notation. Console.log my object dot age using dot notation. And I can access the individual properties. Cool. See, Alex Merced, 35. But there's actually a second way you can access the properties. Console.log. What you can do, it kind of looks like an array. I can use square brackets after the object's name, and I can pass a string with the property name in it. So this is the same thing as the previous two lines. Console.log my object. I think here age. Okay, and that'll give me the same thing as before. Now I'm just gonna have it twice. So if I run the code, node101.js, see Alex Merced 35, Alex Merced 35. So there's two ways for me to access the values in an object. I can, most of the time you'll do it dot notation because that's the easier way by far. But once in a while you may need to do this because you may not necessarily know what value you are accessing. So you have to pass in a variable that has a string inside of it to get what you need. Again, watch my objects masterclass to go deeper into how all that works and different examples. But see, I can store multiple values here. Cool. Now, our final topic, and then at this point, like you'll have kind of learned enough that you should probably spend some time practicing what we've covered, watching the individual masterclass videos I have on those specific topics. So like there's a masterclass video on conditionals, masterclass video on loops, masterclass video on arrays, masterclass video on objects, and masterclass video on strings. Watch all those videos to kind of get a more in-depth thing on those. But now you're gonna kind of have an idea of sort of like the you know, bird's eye view of the language. Cool. So then next, we're gonna talk about functions. So basically creating your own functions. And there's actually 3 ways to write functions. I'm only gonna go over one of them to keep things simple. Watch my functions masterclass to kind of see like all the different ways you can write functions and all the really crazy stuff you can do with functions. But bottom line is you just create a variable, const my function. Then you say equals, and we're going to do what's called an arrow function. It's always parentheses, arrow, curly brackets. Okay, so this is a function. That's the syntax for a function. Okay, don't worry about what this means right now. But the curly brackets hold the instructions. So every time I use this function, it's going to do whatever's inside the curly brackets. Okay, so I'm just going to do console.log you ran the function. So now this function is now inside my function and I can use it. I can just do my function and put parentheses after it to use it. Again, functions have to be invoked with parentheses. And I can do this as many times as I want. So I can run that function over and over again. That's the beauty of functions, that you can write that, you can use them over and over again. Let me paste. Let me first copy this again. Control C. Yeah. Okay, I'll just write it. Okay. Escape. There we go. My function. Okay. And then I write the function 3 times. And now if I run the code, see, it just does the thing 3 times. That's the beauty of functions. Okay. And the cool thing is I can do stuff in between. I don't have to do them back to back. It's not like a loop where it's just going to loop back to back to back to back. I can use them in the order I want. So I can console.log something else in between. I can use functions as many times as I want in whatever order I want, and I get something like that. So that's pretty cool. And the cool thing is I can define variables that come in from the outside. So maybe I want to give information to this function to do something with. Okay, so I can create a variable, we'll call it thing. So basically this is what's called a parameter. It's a variable that the function has to receive things from the outside. So now let's just say instead I'm going to console log thing. Okay, so now the first time I run my function, I'm going to pass it hello. So hello is my argument I'm passing to the function. That argument gets the first argument gets stored in the first parameter, and it just does the thing. So then the second time is going to be world, and the third time we'll put goodbye. And see, I get hello world goodbye. Okay. I could ask to pass a second object, so we'll say thing2. Okay, and then I can pass another thing. So I can say world cheese adios. And see, the second argument I pass into each function will end up taking the place of thing2 in the function. And we'll just say I'm going to console log thing and thing2. Okay, so both of them will get logged. And what do I get? Hello world, world cheese, goodbye, adios. Okay, so that's neat. Okay, that works for me. That's what a function is. It just allows you to kind of create like a preset recipe to do something. You can take details from the outside and do something with it. There's a lot more to functions, just stuff like return values, and then there's a lot of other fun topics like destructuring objects and arrays, spread operator, a lot of other really cool topics in JavaScript. But I'm going to leave it here. This is a pretty good sort of place to start. So if you're new to JavaScript, this should give you a nice solid start in getting used to working with JavaScript. A good place to practice is to head over to codewars.com. Okay, this is a great place to find like coding challenges. And again, you know, a lot of times you'll do these coding challenges, you may not initially have an idea of how to do it. You know, practice it, Google, try to think of what the steps you would like to take are, and then try to Google how to do those steps one by one to learn more about the language. But basically you have kata, which are like different like coding challenges. Now, if you're a newbie, look for the ones that say grasshopper in the name, because these are all going to be really, really easy. And then you'd want to see, you would look for the JavaScript symbol, which is this symbol right here, and then you would just do you click on it, and you see this algorithm. You would write the function here that does the thing that it specifies that you need to do. Okay, and then you'll see this part down here you don't touch. This is just the test that it's running your code through. All you care here is that this thing does what it explains here. Then you would test it by clicking test down here. Right now it'll fail, so see, all the tests will fail because I haven't written any code. And then once I get that all these tests are green, so all the tests succeed, then I'll do an actual attempt. They'll posit even more tests. And then once I get all the tests to be successful, then I've completed the challenge. So it's a great way to practice, a great way to really build up your skills with the language. But first just get used to doing the basics, so just like making some arrays and whatnot. But these grasshopper ones are pretty good. With that, I'll end the video here. You guys have a great day and enjoy.